I have been dead for 7 years, 3 months and 16 days. The Imperium simply has not told my body yet. The iron door sealed behind me with a sound like breaking bones, and I knew then that I would never again see the pale light of Tertius Prime's dying sun. The guards did not speak my crimes aloud because they did not matter anymore. Heresy, sedition, failure to meet tithe obligations, speaking against a planetary governor's nephew who wore the uniform of the Astra Militarum like a costume at a masquerade. The charges blur together in this place because guilt and innocence are concepts that exist only in the world above, in that distant realm where people still believe in justice and redemption. Here in the bowels of Penitentia Maxima, there is only endurance. The intake chamber smelled of disinfectant and fear sweat, a combination that burned the nostrils and lingered at the back of the throat like a promise of sickness to come. Hundreds of us stood in lines that stretched beyond the reach of the flickering lumens, our shackles clinking in a rhythm that sounded almost like prayer beads being worked through desperate fingers. The man beside me, a thin merchant who had been caught selling counterfeit devotional candles, wept silently as the servitors processed us one by one. His tears fell onto the stained concrete floor and disappeared without trace, absorbed instantly by stone that had drunk the moisture of 10,000 souls before him. The servitor that catalogued my existence had once been human. Its face was a patchwork of flesh and metal, one eye replaced by a crude optical scanner that whirred and clicked as it examined my features. The other eye, still organic, still human, watched me with something that might have been pity if such emotions were permitted to survive the lobotomization process. It pressed cold metal fingers against my throat, recording my pulse, my temperature, the subtle chemical signatures that would identify my corpse when the time came. Inmate 779588. It said in a voice like grinding gears. Classification, political. Subclassification, sedition, minor. Estimated survival duration, 8 to 12 months standard. 8 to 12 months. They had calculated my death before I had even seen my cell. The uniform they gave me was brown, the color of dried blood or rusted iron. It hung loose on my frame, designed not for comfort, but for easy identification should I attempt escape. The fabric was rough against my skin, woven from reclaimed fibers that still carried the scent of whoever had worn it before me. I tried not to think about whether they had died in it or simply outgrown the need for clothing altogether. My cell was a cube of reinforced rockcrete, 3 meters wide, 2 meters deep, and just tall enough that I could stand without my head touching the ceiling if I did not straighten my shoulders completely. The walls wept condensation constantly, creating dark stains that resembled maps of worlds I would never see again. A narrow slot near the floor allowed the guards to slide in my daily ration of Nutri paste, and another slot at eye level permitted them to observe me at their leisure. There was no window, no source of natural light, only the harsh glare of a single lumen strip that never dimmed and never failed. The sleeping platform was a shelf of raw metal welded to the wall. No mattress, no pillow, no covering except the uniform on my back. The cold seeped through the fabric within minutes, settling into my bones like a parasite that fed on warmth and hope. I learned quickly that sleep was not rest in this place, but merely another form of survival, a temporary escape from consciousness that left me more exhausted than waking. The first night, I listened to the sounds of Penitentia Maxima learning to breathe around me. The walls carried voices from distant cells, fragments of prayers and curses and mad laughter that echoed through the ventilation shafts like the whispers of the damned. Someone was screaming 3 levels below, a raw sound that went on and on until it became part of the ambient noise, no more remarkable than the humming of the power generators or the skittering of rats in the walls. I counted the seconds between the guard patrols, memorizing their rhythm like a litany. Every 8 minutes and 43 seconds, the heavy tread of armored boots would pass my door, pause for exactly 7 seconds while they checked the observation slot, then continue down the corridor. The guards were not quite human anymore, their bodies augmented with crude bionics that allowed them to work longer shifts without rest. Their eyes had been replaced with sensors that could see in perfect darkness, and their voices carried the mechanical undertones of Voxcaster implants. They took pleasure in our misery, but it was a cold pleasure, surgical and efficient. They did not hate us personally because that would have required them to see us as individuals rather than resources to be managed until depletion. We were inventory, nothing more. Inventory with an unfortunate tendency towards spoilage. The morning brought the first meal, if the grey paste that slid through the food slot could be called by such a generous name. It tasted of nothing and everything, a carefully engineered blend of recycled protein and synthetic vitamins that would keep a human body functioning at minimal capacity for months or even years. I ate it with my fingers because no utensils were provided, licking the aluminum tray clean because I did not know when the next meal would come, or if it would come at all. Later, I learned that the paste contained more than nutrients. Mild sedatives to reduce aggression, mood stabilizers to prevent suicide attempts, and trace amounts of psychoactive compounds that made the mind more susceptible to suggestion and conditioning. The first few weeks of ingesting this chemical cocktail left me feeling disconnected from my own thoughts, as if I were watching someone else live my life through a sheet of dirty glass. The other inmates were shadows at first, glimpsed through the gaps in cell doors or heard as disembodied voices in the darkness. The man in the cell to my left had been there for 6 years. He had been a clerk in the Planetary Defense Force, convicted of falsifying requisition reports to feed his family during a famine. His name was Marcus, and he talked constantly to keep madness at bay, telling me about his wife and children who had probably forgotten his face by now. "The trick is to remember who you were," he would whisper through the thin wall between our cells. "Hold on to something, anything, from before. A smell, a song, the way sunlight looked through your window. The moment you let go of that, you become what they want you to become." The woman across the corridor screamed in her sleep every night for the first month I was there. Her dreams were full of fire and burning children, the memories of a planet that had died while she watched from an orbital transport. She had been a refugee administrator, charged with corruption because she had diverted supplies to save more lives than the official quotas allowed. Her crime was compassion, and her punishment was to relive the consequences of that compassion until she died. Labor began on my 5th day. They woke us before dawn, which meant nothing in a place where dawn was a concept from another life, and marched us through corridors that stretched beyond the horizon of our understanding. Penitentia Maxima was not merely a prison but an entire industrial complex built around the efficient extraction of labor from disposable human resources. The work was brutal, mindless, and designed to break both body and spirit through repetition and futility. My assignment was the Forge Works, a cavern of heat and smoke where we assembled components for weapons that would be used to conquer worlds we would never see. The temperature was maintained at just below the threshold of what human flesh could endure, hot enough to weaken us but not hot enough to kill us quickly. The air was thick with metal particles and chemical vapors that burned the lungs and left a taste like copper pennies on the tongue. We worked in teams of 12, our movements choreographed by the rhythm of the production line and the ever-present threat of the shock prods carried by our supervisors. The components we assembled were simple things: trigger mechanisms for LAS rifles, power coupling for vehicle engines, guidance chips for artillery shells. Each piece had to meet precise specifications, and failure to maintain quality standards resulted in immediate punishment. The punishments were creative in their cruelty. A worker whose hands shook too much from exhaustion might have those hands secured in metal braces that forced them to work in increasingly painful positions. Someone who fell behind the production pace would be fitted with stimulant injectors that kept them conscious and functional, even as their body began to shut down from fatigue. The supervisors took careful notes on which punishments were most effective at improving productivity, treating us as subjects in a grand experiment in human endurance. I learned to lose myself in the work, to let my mind drift away from my body while my hands continued their mechanical movements. This dissociation was survival, a way of preserving some small core of self while the prison consumed everything else. but it came at a cost. Days blurred together into an endless present tense, where past and future became abstract concepts. I began to forget the color of grass, the sound of rain, the feeling of wind that did not smell of industrial chemicals. The social dynamics of the prison were as complex as they were vicious. Alliances formed and dissolved based on the shifting currents of power and desperation. The strongest inmates, usually those with military backgrounds or criminal experience, established themselves as leaders of informal gangs that controlled the distribution of contraband and the assignment of cell blocks. They demanded tribute in the form of food rations, protection services, or sexual favors, and their enforcement methods were brutal and immediate. I aligned myself with a group led by a former sergeant named Kane, a man whose body was a catalogue of scars from a dozen different battlefields. He had been convicted of abandoning his post during a chaos cult uprising, though he claimed he had been saving civilians when his commanding officer branded him a coward. Kane understood the value of discipline and organization, and under his protection I learned the unwritten rules that governed life in Penitentia Maxima. Never show weakness, because weakness was blood in the water, and the predators here were always hungry. Never volunteer for anything, because volunteers were the first to die in whatever new horror the guards had devised. Never trust anyone completely, because betrayal was sometimes the only currency that could buy survival. Never give up hope, because hope was the only thing that separated the living from the walking dead, even if that hope was nothing more than the possibility of dying quickly instead of slowly. The guards encouraged conflict between inmates because fighting prisoners were easier to control than organized ones. They would deliberately create situations where we were forced to compete for resources or privileges, then step back and watch us tear each other apart with the detached interest of scientists observing laboratory animals. The winners of these conflicts received small rewards, extra food or improved cell assignments, but the victories were always temporary, and the costs were always permanent. I killed my first man on a Tuesday, or what I had decided to call Tuesday in the timeless hell of our underground world. His name was Singh, and he had been a tax collector before his arrest for skimming from the Imperial tithe. He was small and quick, with the cunning of a man who had spent his life finding ways to take what belonged to others. He had been stealing from my food rations for weeks, taking just enough that I would feel constantly hungry, but not so much that I would notice the theft immediately. When I finally caught him, he laughed and told me I was too weak to do anything about it. He was wrong. The beating I gave him was not passionate or angry, but methodical, calculated to inflict maximum damage while avoiding the attention of the guards. I used techniques I had learned watching other inmates settle their disputes, targeting joints and soft tissues where the evidence of violence would be less visible. When he stopped moving, I felt nothing except a mild satisfaction that the problem had been resolved. The guards found his body during the next cell inspection. They recorded his death as natural causes, heart failure brought on by poor nutrition and stress. No one questioned this diagnosis because questioning would have required paperwork and investigations that served no useful purpose. Singh disappeared from the prisoner manifest as if he had never existed, and someone else was assigned to his cell within hours. That night, Kane nodded to me with something that might have been approval. "You're learning," he said. "The first kill is always the hardest. After that, it's just another skill, like welding or reading or any other thing you need to know to get by." He was right. The second death came easier, and the third easier still. By the end of my first year in Penitentia Maxima, I had stopped counting. Violence became just another aspect of daily routine, no more remarkable than eating or sleeping or working the production lines. The capacity for horror that had once defined the limits of my imagination expanded to accommodate realities I could never have conceived in my previous life. But the physical violence was only the most visible aspect of how the prison consumed us. The real destruction happened slowly, invisibly, in the gradual erosion of everything that made us human. They fed us just enough to keep us functional, but never enough to feel satisfied. They gave us just enough sleep to prevent total collapse, but never enough to feel rested. They provided just enough medical care to prevent epidemics, but never enough to eliminate suffering. The psychological warfare was more sophisticated. They would occasionally announce that certain prisoners were being considered for early release, creating desperate competitions, as inmates tried to prove their rehabilitation through increased productivity or voluntary cooperation with the guards. These announcements were always lies. No one left Penitentia Maxima except in body bags or as components for the Servitor conversion programs. The Servitor program was perhaps the cruelest deception of all. Prisoners who volunteered for conversion were promised that their consciousness would be preserved in some form, that they would continue to exist as valuable servants of the Imperium rather than dying as forgotten criminals. The reality was lobotomization followed by cybernetic implantation, a process that left behind only enough brain function to operate simple machinery and follow basic commands. The servitors that maintained the prison had once been inmates like us, their humanity surgically excised and replaced with mechanical obedience. I watched friends disappear into the conversion chambers, convinced they were choosing survival over death. Marcus, the clerk who had helped me understand the rules of survival, volunteered after receiving news that his family had been declared dead in a mining accident. He could not bear the thought of continuing to exist in a world where his suffering served no purpose, and the promise of mechanical peace seemed preferable to conscious despair. The last time I saw him, he was sweeping the corridor outside my cell, his movements precise and repetitive. His eyes had been replaced with optical sensors, and his skull bore the surgical scars where his personality had been carved away. I called his name, but he did not respond. Marcus was gone, replaced by a thing that wore his face and carried his memories but lacked any trace of his soul. The seasons changed above us, though we knew of them only through the subtle variations in temperature and humidity that filtered down through the ventilation systems. Summer brought stifling heat that made the already unbearable work conditions nearly lethal. Winter brought a chill that seeped through the rockcrete and settled in our bones, making every movement painful and every breath visible in the frigid air. Years passed, or what felt like years. Time became elastic in the eternal twilight of the prison, stretching and compressing according to the rhythms of pain and relief that structured our existence. I lost track of my own age, forgetting whether I was 30 or 50 or somewhere in between. My hair went gray, then white, then began to fall out in clumps from the chemical exposure in the factories. My teeth loosened and several fell out, leaving gaps that made eating more difficult and speaking more labored. The woman who screamed in her sleep died during my third winter. I heard her final breath through the wall between our cells, a rattling exhalation that seemed to go on forever before finally stopping. The guards did not remove her body for 2 days, and the smell of decay filled our entire block with a sweetish stench that clung to everything and everyone. When they finally came for her, they were not gentle. I heard her remains being dragged down the corridor, a sound like wet cloth being pulled across rough stone. New prisoners arrived constantly, taking the places of those who had died or been converted, or simply disappeared into the administrative maze that swallowed inconvenient people. They came with the same wide-eyed terror I had once felt, asking the same questions about justice and appeals and contact with the outside world. The older inmates would look at them with expressions of distant pity, knowing that these newcomers would either adapt or die, but that they would never again be the people they had been before walking through those iron doors. I tried to help some of them, sharing what I had learned about survival and the unwritten rules that governed our existence. Most listened politely and then ignored my advice, convinced that their situation was temporary or that their innocence would somehow protect them from the grinding machinery of institutional cruelty. A few learned quickly enough to survive their first year. Many did not. The gladiatorial combats began during my 4th year, though the guards called them disciplinary exhibitions in their official reports. Prisoners who violated rules or failed to meet production quotas were selected to fight each other in a makeshift arena constructed in one of the larger storage chambers. The fights were not to the death officially, but serious injuries were common and medical treatment was minimal. The guards and administrators would watch from elevated platforms, placing bets on the outcomes and discussing the fighters' techniques with the detached professionalism of livestock breeders. I was selected for the arena after striking a guard who had been taunting a dying man in the cell next to mine. The guard had been describing in graphic detail how the man's family had been sold into indentured servitude to pay his outstanding debts, taking pleasure in each wince and sob his words produced. When I told him to stop, he turned his attention to me, speculating about what services my body might provide once I was too weak to work the production lines. The blow I struck was instinctive, driven by a rage that had been building for years but had never found an appropriate target. My fist caught him in the throat, crushing his larynx and sending him to his knees, gasping for air that would not come. He did not die, but he would never speak normally again, and the mechanical wheeze that replaced his voice became a constant reminder of what defiance could accomplish when properly applied. My opponent in the arena was a massive man named Voss, a former pit fighter who had been imprisoned for killing a planetary governor's son in an unsanctioned bout. He was everything I was not. Young, strong, experienced in violence, and completely without fear or hesitation. The crowd of guards and administrators cheered as he entered the arena, their voices echoing off the concrete walls like the howling of hungry animals. The weapons provided were crude but effective. Lengths of sharpened rebar, weighted chains, broken bottles wrapped in cloth for better grip. I chose a piece of pipe with enough weight to crush bone but not so heavy that it would slow my movements. Voss selected a chain, testing its balance with the professional assessment of someone who had spent years learning how to inflict pain efficiently. The fight lasted 17 minutes, though it felt like hours. Voss was stronger and faster, but I had advantages he did not expect: desperation, cunning, and the accumulated rage of years spent watching good people destroyed by a system that fed on suffering. I avoided his direct attacks, using the arena's dimensions to stay mobile, looking for openings created by his confidence and aggression. When the opening came, I took it without hesitation. He overextended during a particularly vicious swing, and I stepped inside his guard, driving the pipe into his solar plexus with enough force to rupture internal organs. He folded around the impact, his breath coming in short gasps that sprayed blood onto the arena floor. I hit him again, this time across the base of his skull, and he fell forward into his own blood, twitching once before becoming still. The crowd cheered my victory, but their applause felt like condemnation. I had become exactly what they wanted me to become: a killer who performed violence for their entertainment, a broken thing that had forgotten the difference between survival and surrender. The guards returned me to my cell with expressions of satisfaction, as if I had passed some crucial test that proved their methods were working as intended. The victories that followed were easier, technically, but more difficult emotionally. Each opponent was another prisoner like myself, someone who had been shaped by the same forces and driven to the same desperate measures. I killed them efficiently, without passion or hatred, because efficiency was what the situation required, and because caring too much about the people I killed would have made survival impossible. Between fights, I worked the production lines and tried to remember who I had been before becoming a gladiator. The memories were fading, becoming abstract and uncertain, like stories someone had told me about people I had never met. Had I really been a teacher once, standing in front of classrooms full of children who looked at me with respect and affection? Had I really lived in a small house with a garden where I grew vegetables and flowers for no reason except that I found beauty in growing things? The details blurred together until I could not be certain what was memory and what was imagination. Perhaps I had never been anything except what I was now: a prisoner, a killer, a thing that existed only to serve as an example of what happened to those who opposed the Imperium's will. Perhaps my previous life was just a delusion, a comforting lie I had created to make my current existence bearable. Cain died during my 5th year, killed not by violence but by a cancer that had been growing in his lungs for months. The chemicals in the air had finally accumulated to toxic levels, and his body simply stopped being able to process the poison. He faced death with the same steady pragmatism he had brought to everything else, giving me advice about leadership and survival until his voice became too weak to carry across the cell. "Don't let them make you into something you can't live with," he told me during our last conversation. "I've seen good men become monsters in here, and monsters who found ways to stay human. The choice is always yours, even when it doesn't feel like there's a choice at all." His death left a vacuum in the prison's power structure that other inmates immediately moved to fill. The contests for leadership were violent and brief, resolved through assassination and betrayal rather than democratic process. I avoided involvement in these struggles, having learned that visibility was dangerous and that the safest position was often somewhere in the middle of the hierarchy, where you were valuable enough to protect, but not important enough to threaten. The new leader was a woman named Catherine, a former naval officer who had been convicted of mutiny after refusing orders to bombard a civilian population center. She was intelligent, ruthless, and completely committed to survival at any cost. Under her leadership, the prisoner organization became more efficient, but also more brutal, with harsh punishments for any perceived disloyalty or weakness. She approached me after one of my arena victories, studying me with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten how to show mercy. "You fight well," she said, "but you fight like someone who still thinks he's going to leave this place. That's going to get you killed eventually." She was right, though I did not want to admit it at the time. Some part of me was still holding on to the possibility of escape, release, or redemption, and that hope was making me careless. The most dangerous prisoners were those who had accepted their fate completely, who had stopped thinking about the future and focused entirely on the immediate requirements of survival. The escape attempt came during my 6th year, organized by a group of political prisoners who had managed to bribe several guards and acquire detailed maps of the prison's layout. They invited me to join them, recognizing my combat skills and relatively good physical condition as assets that could improve their chances of success. The plan was complex but achievable. Create a distraction during a shift change, overpower the guards at a secondary checkpoint, and use maintenance tunnels to reach the surface before the alarm could be raised. I agreed to participate, though I knew the attempt was doomed, not because the plan was flawed, but because escape was never really about leaving the prison. The real prison was what we had become during our years of incarceration, the accumulated damage to our minds and souls that could not be left behind simply by walking through a different door. We were planning to take our cells with us wherever we went. The attempt failed exactly as I had expected, though not for the reasons I had anticipated. The guards had known about the plan from the beginning, having been informed by one of the conspirators who had been promised better treatment in exchange for cooperation. The informant was a man named Peter, a former accountant who had been slowly dying from malnutrition and wanted to improve his chances of living long enough to see another winter. The guards allowed the escape attempt to proceed until we had committed ourselves completely, then triggered alarms and sealed the tunnels we were using for our route. The hunt that followed was not urgent or desperate, but methodical, like exterminators tracking down vermin that had gotten into the walls. They used gas to force us out of hiding places, shock prods to disable anyone who resisted, and casual violence to discourage future escape attempts. Of the 12 prisoners who participated in the attempt, 4 were killed immediately, 3 were selected for servitor conversion, and the remaining 5 were returned to general population with enhanced restrictions and monitoring. I was among the survivors, though I was not certain whether that represented good or bad fortune. The enhanced restrictions meant solitary confinement for months, reduced food rations, and elimination from work assignments that might provide opportunities for further escape planning. Solitary confinement was a different kind of death, slower but more thorough than the quick violence of the arena. The cell was smaller than my regular accommodations, barely large enough to lie down with my arms extended. No light except what filtered through a crack under the door. No human contact except the daily delivery of food. No sounds except my own breathing and heartbeat, and the gradual dissolution of my sanity. I talked to myself constantly, carrying on conversations with people from my past who existed now only in increasingly unreliable memories. I told stories to the walls, recited poetry I half remembered from school, and sang songs whose words had been eroded by time and stress until only the melodies remained. The boundary between internal dialogue and external speech disappeared, and I found myself responding to voices that existed only in my head as if they were real people sitting beside me in the dark. The hallucinations began after the third month, visual distortions that resolved into faces when I was not looking at them directly, movements in the peripheral vision that suggested the presence of people who were not there, shadows that seemed to have depth and substance even in the absolute darkness of the cell. I knew these perceptions were not real, but knowledge did not make them less vivid or less disturbing. When they finally returned me to general population, I discovered that the prison had changed in ways that went beyond normal attrition and replacement. New policies had been implemented, new punishments devised, new forms of degradation introduced for the entertainment of the guards and administrators. The gladiatorial combats had been expanded into a full tournament system, with brackets and championships and betting pools that involved personnel from throughout the correctional system. The food had gotten worse, the work assignments more dangerous, the medical care more perfunctory. Prisoners were dying at an accelerated rate, their bodies unable to cope with the increased demands and reduced support. The administration seemed to have concluded that the facility was becoming too expensive to maintain and had decided to resolve the problem by working the prisoners to death as quickly as possible. I had been selected as a featured competitor in the championship tournament, my reputation as an arena fighter having grown during my absence. The other prisoners looked at me with expressions I could not interpret: fear, respect, envy, and something else that might have been pity. They knew, as I was beginning to understand, that being good at violence in this place was not an advantage, but a curse that would eventually consume everything else I might have been. The tournament was structured as a series of elimination bouts, with the winners advancing to face increasingly dangerous opponents until only one fighter remained. The prizes for victory were meaningless: extra food rations, improved cell assignments, and the promise of reduced sentences that everyone knew would never be honored. The real purpose was entertainment, a gladiatorial spectacle that allowed the guards to bet on outcomes while watching prisoners destroy each other for their amusement. My first opponent was a young man named David, barely 20 years old, and convicted of draft evasion during a planetary defense mobilization. He had been in the prison for less than a year, and his body still showed signs of the life he had lived before his arrest. He moved like someone who had never learned to fight properly, relying on desperation and adrenaline rather than technique and experience. I killed him quickly, efficiently, and without pleasure. The crowd cheered, but their voices sounded distant and unimportant, like background noise from another room. I had crossed some invisible line during my months in solitary confinement, and the emotional responses that had once made violence difficult were no longer accessible to me. I felt nothing when he died except a mild satisfaction that the problem had been resolved. The subsequent matches followed the same pattern, opponent after opponent, each one desperate and frightened and ultimately insufficient to the task of survival. I dispatched them with increasing mechanical precision, my movements becoming more efficient as I eliminated anything that was not essential to winning. The crowds grew larger and more enthusiastic as word spread throughout the facility about the tournament's progress. The final match was against Catherine, the naval officer who had taken over Kane's position as leader of the prisoner organization. She was older, more experienced, and completely ruthless in her approach to both leadership and combat. More importantly, she had nothing left to lose, having long ago abandoned any hope of survival or redemption in favor of simple endurance. "One of us walks away," she told me as we prepared for the fight. "The other becomes fertilizer for whatever weeds grow in the prison graveyard. But either way, we're both already dead. We died the day we walked through those doors. Everything since then has just been the body learning to catch up." She was right, and that knowledge liberated me from the last constraints of conscience and humanity. I fought her with everything I had learned during my years in Penitentia Maxima, using every technique of violence and deception that had allowed me to survive when better people had died. The match lasted longer than any of the others, both of us too experienced to make the obvious mistakes that would have ended the fight quickly. When I finally killed her, it was through treachery rather than superior skill. I feigned an injury that caused her to lower her guard for just long enough to position myself for a killing blow. The strike caught her in the temple, crushing the bone and driving fragments into her brain. She fell without a sound, her face showing no surprise or accusation, only the distant expression of someone who had been expecting this moment for a very long time. The crowd erupted in celebration, their cheers echoing off the concrete walls like the screaming of the damned. I stood over Catherine's body, covered in her blood and my own, feeling absolutely nothing. The tournament was over, the championship was mine, and none of it mattered because we were all already dead and had been dead from the beginning. They returned me to my cell that night with promises of rewards and improved conditions that I knew were lies. The tournament had served its purpose, providing entertainment for the guards and demonstrating to the other prisoners what happened to those who became too skilled at violence. I would continue to fight when called upon, continue to kill whoever they placed in front of me until I became too old or too damaged to be useful and was quietly disposed of. The years that followed blurred together into an indistinguishable mass of routine violence and grinding despair. I fought in the arena when summoned, worked the production lines when assigned, and existed in my cell during the hours between obligations. The other prisoners avoided me now, recognizing that I had become something different from what I had been, something more dangerous, but also more broken. New inmates continued to arrive, taking the places of those who had died or been converted or simply disappeared into the administrative machinery that processed human suffering with industrial efficiency. I watched them go through the same stages of adaptation or destruction that I had experienced, but I felt no connection to their struggles and offered no assistance or advice. Their survival or death was irrelevant to me, because survival itself had become irrelevant. The dreams, when they came, were not of freedom or revenge or justice, but of simple non-existence. I dreamed of dissolving into the walls of my cell, becoming part of the stone and metal that contained us all. I dreamed of forgetting my own name, my own history, my own face in whatever mirror might still show reflections in this place. I dreamed of peace, the kind that comes only when consciousness finally stops and the burden of selfhood is lifted from shoulders that have carried it too long. But consciousness persisted, stubborn and unwelcome, dragging me through each day and into each night with mechanical regularity. My body continued to function despite the accumulated damage from years of poor nutrition, chemical exposure, and frequent violence. My mind continued to process sensory input and form memories, even though the experiences being recorded were too similar to previous experiences to be worth remembering. I measured time now, not in days or months, but in deaths. The deaths of opponents in the arena, the deaths of cellmates from disease or violence or simple exhaustion, the deaths of parts of myself that had once seemed essential but had proven to be expendable when survival demanded it. Each death was a mark on an invisible calendar that tracked my journey from human being to something else, something that wore human shape but had forgotten human purpose. The administrators occasionally visited my cell, studying me with the clinical interest of scientists observing a successful experiment. They asked questions about my experiences, my observations about prison conditions, my recommendations for improving the efficiency of the correctional process. I answered honestly because honesty required less effort than deception, and because truth and lies had lost their distinction in a place where neither mattered. "You've adapted remarkably well," one of them told me during a particularly lengthy interview. "Most prisoners either break completely or maintain enough resistance to be problematic. You've found the optimal balance between compliance and functionality." I asked him what that meant, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "It means you've become exactly what the system was designed to produce," he said. A human being who has been stripped of everything that makes resistance possible while retaining enough cognitive capacity to serve useful functions. You're a template for the future of Imperial corrections. He was proud of what they had accomplished, proud of the transformation they had worked upon my flesh and soul. I was their masterpiece, proof that any human consciousness could be broken down and rebuilt according to institutional needs. The man I had been before my arrest was completely gone, replaced by something that looked like him but shared none of his essential characteristics. That night, I lay on my metal sleeping platform and tried to remember what I had looked like before becoming a prisoner. The face that appeared in my memory was generic, unremarkable, possibly imaginary. I could not recall the color of my eyes, the shape of my nose, or the way my mouth had moved when I smiled. The person who had worn that face was a stranger to me now, someone whose motivations and desires were as foreign as those of an alien species. The final revelation came during my 10th year in Penitentia Maxima, though the exact timing might have been different because time had lost most of its meaning by then. A new administrator arrived to take charge of the facility, a young woman with the kind of fresh enthusiasm that suggested she had not yet learned to see prisoners as anything other than human beings who had made mistakes. She instituted reforms: better food, improved medical care, educational programs designed to prepare inmates for eventual release. The changes were modest but noticeable, and for the first time in years I felt something that might have been hope stirring in the depths of my consciousness. Perhaps redemption was possible after all. Perhaps the person I had been before my arrest was not completely dead but merely dormant, waiting for the right conditions to emerge from whatever dark corner of my mind still remembered how to be human. The new administrator, whose name was Elena Vasquez, requested individual meetings with long-term prisoners to assess their rehabilitation potential. When my turn came, I found myself sitting across from her in a small office that had been decorated with plants and pictures of worlds where sunlight still fell on green growing things. The normalcy of the setting was disorienting after years of concrete and metal, and I had difficulty focusing on her questions because I kept staring at a photograph of children playing in a park somewhere far from this place. "You've been here longer than almost anyone else," she said, consulting a file that contained the accumulated documentation of my decade in captivity. 10 years, 4 months, 17 days? That's an unusual length of service for someone with your original classification. Service. She called it service, as if my imprisonment had been a form of employment rather than punishment. I wondered if she truly believed that, or if she was simply using language that made her job more palatable. "What would you like to do if you were released?" she asked, her voice carrying a sincerity that seemed genuine but felt dangerous. Hope was a luxury I could not afford, a weakness that would make survival more difficult if her reforms proved temporary. I told her the truth, that I could not remember wanting anything beyond the basic requirements of continued existence: food, shelter, the absence of immediate pain or threat. The dreams and ambitions that had once motivated my actions were as foreign to me now as the desires of someone from another species. She made notes in my file, her expression showing concern that might have been professional or personal. "The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable," she said, "but it's not irreversible. With proper support and gradual reintegration, even severe psychological damage can be addressed." I wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that some transformations could not be undone once they had reached completion. The man she was trying to rehabilitate no longer existed except as a collection of memories and reflexes that had been repurposed to serve the needs of survival. But I said nothing because hope was precious to her, and destroying it would have served no useful purpose. The educational programs she implemented were voluntary, taught by prisoner volunteers who had managed to retain enough of their former knowledge to serve as instructors. I attended classes in basic literacy and arithmetic, not because I needed the skills, but because the routine provided structure that made the passage of time more bearable. The other students were mostly younger prisoners who had arrived recently enough to still believe in the possibility of eventual release. The instructor for my literacy class was a former librarian named Samuel, a thin man with gentle eyes who had been convicted of possessing banned books. He taught with quiet patience, never showing frustration when students struggled with concepts that had once been simple for them. His crime had been curiosity, the desire to read and understand texts that the authorities had deemed dangerous to public order. Reading is remembering how to be human, he told us during one lesson, his voice barely above a whisper. Every word you understand is a piece of yourself that the system hasn't managed to destroy yet. He was killed 3 weeks later during a fight in the dining hall, struck in the head with a metal tray by an inmate who wanted his extra food ration. The educational programs continued under new instructors, but something essential had been lost with Samuel's death. The replacement teachers taught the mechanics of literacy without understanding its deeper significance, turning education into just another form of labor rather than a pathway back to humanity. Administrator Vasquez lasted 8 months before being reassigned to duties that better matched her temperament and experience. The official reason given was budget constraints that required a more efficient management approach, but everyone understood the real explanation. Compassion was expensive, and the Imperium had limited resources to waste on the rehabilitation of people who would never again be useful citizens. Her replacement was Colonel Marcus Thorne, a former military police officer who had earned his reputation managing prisoner of war camps during the Third Tarsius campaign. He arrived with a mandate to reduce operational costs while maintaining productivity levels, and his methods reflected the straightforward brutality of someone who viewed prisoners as enemy combatants rather than citizens who had made mistakes. The reforms instituted by Administrator Vasquez were reversed within days of Thorne's arrival. Food rations returned to subsistence levels, medical care became purely emergency-focused, and the educational programs were eliminated entirely in favor of expanded work shifts. The gladiatorial tournaments were reinstated and expanded, with increased frequency and more elaborate prize structures designed to encourage maximum prisoner participation. Rehabilitation is a luxury we cannot afford, Thorne announced during his first address to the prisoner population. Your purpose here is not to become better people, but to serve the Imperium through productive labor until your sentences are completed or your usefulness expires. Those who accept this reality will find their remaining time here more tolerable than those who persist in unrealistic expectations. The return to the old system was swift and comprehensive, but something had changed during the brief period of reform that could not be entirely undone. Some prisoners had remembered what it felt like to be treated as human beings rather than resources, and that memory created a form of resistance that was more dangerous than any physical rebellion. They began to organize quietly, sharing information and resources in ways that suggested the possibility of coordinated action. I was approached by several groups seeking to recruit me for various schemes, some focused on escape and others on sabotage or protest. My reputation as an arena fighter made me valuable to anyone planning violent resistance, while my long tenure gave me insights into prison operations that could be useful for more subtle forms of opposition. I declined all invitations, recognizing that organized resistance would only provide the administration with excuses for harsher measures. The crackdown began 3 months after Thorne's arrival, triggered by the discovery of a smuggling network that had been moving contraband between cell blocks. The investigation that followed was thorough and brutal, involving interrogations, searches, and punishments that were designed to extract information while discouraging future conspiracies. Prisoners were turned against each other through promises of improved treatment or threats of enhanced punishment, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and betrayal that made any form of cooperation dangerous. I was questioned repeatedly about my knowledge of resistance activities, my relationships with other prisoners, and my willingness to serve as an informant in exchange for better conditions. The interrogations were conducted by specialist personnel who understood the psychology of long-term prisoners and knew which pressures would be most effective at breaking down whatever remained of our solidarity. "You're a survivor," the lead interrogator told me during our final session. You've lasted 10 years by adapting to changing conditions and avoiding unnecessary risks. Cooperation with our investigation would be consistent with that pattern of intelligent self-preservation. He was offering me a choice between collaboration and continued resistance, though both options led ultimately to the same destination. Collaborators were useful only as long as they provided valuable information, after which they became liabilities to be disposed of quietly. Resistors were simply disposed of more quickly and with less ceremony. I chose a third option, complete withdrawal from any activities that might be interpreted as either cooperation or resistance. I attended no meetings, joined no conversations that might be construed as planning, and avoided any associations that could be seen as suspicious. I worked when assigned, fought when summoned, and existed in my cell during all other hours like a machine that had been powered down between operational periods. This strategy of strategic invisibility proved effective at avoiding official attention, but it came at the cost of complete isolation from whatever remained of the prisoner community. Other inmates began to avoid me, uncertain whether I had become an informant or simply lost my mind entirely. I became a ghost within the prison, present but not participating, alive but not really living. The resistance network was eventually destroyed through a combination of investigation and betrayal, its members either executed or transferred to facilities with even harsher conditions. The administration celebrated their victory with renewed restrictions on prisoner movement and communication, implementing surveillance measures that made any form of unauthorized association nearly impossible. Colonel Thorne summoned me to his office after the last of the conspirators had been dealt with, studying me with the calculating expression of a man who was trying to solve a puzzle that did not quite fit his usual categories of understanding. 43 prisoners were involved in resistance activities, he said, reading from a report on his desk. 43 individuals who chose to risk everything for the illusion of freedom or dignity or whatever concept they thought was worth dying for. You were not among them, despite having both the skills and the relationships that would have made you a valuable recruit. He paused, waiting for me to explain my absence from the conspiracy, but I had nothing to say that would satisfy his curiosity without creating new problems for myself. Intelligence suggests you're either the smartest prisoner in this facility or the most broken, he continued. Either way, you represent a useful data point for understanding long-term adaptation to correctional environments. You'll be transferred to the research wing for extended observation and testing. The research wing was located in the deepest levels of Penitentia Maxima, accessible only through security checkpoints that required multiple forms of authorization. The prisoners housed there were subjects in ongoing experiments designed to improve the efficiency of rehabilitation, punishment, and control techniques. Some were volunteers who had been promised better conditions in exchange for participation. Others were simply selected based on characteristics that made them suitable for particular research protocols. My new accommodations were an improvement over standard prison cells: larger space, better lighting, temperature control, and even a small window that showed a view of the underground caverns where waste processing and power generation equipment operated around the clock. The improvements were not gestures of kindness but practical necessities for maintaining research subjects in optimal condition over extended periods. The testing began immediately, conducted by teams of specialists who measured everything from reaction times and cognitive capacity to stress responses and pain tolerance. They were mapping the changes that 10 years of imprisonment had worked upon my mind and body, documenting the transformation from functional citizen to institutional artifact with scientific precision. The physical examinations revealed the accumulated damage of a decade spent in chemical-laden air, eating synthetic food, and enduring frequent violence. My lungs showed scarring from industrial pollutants. My bones had lost density from poor nutrition, and my nervous system displayed the kind of hypervigilance patterns typically found in combat veterans. I was a catalogue of institutional injuries, a living record of what prolonged exposure to correctional environments could accomplish. The psychological evaluations were more complex, involving tests designed to measure empathy, social connection, moral reasoning, and emotional responsiveness. The researchers seemed particularly interested in my capacity for violence and the psychological mechanisms that allowed me to kill other prisoners without apparent emotional distress. They administered scenarios and simulations that required me to make choices between self-preservation and the welfare of others, carefully recording my responses and the reasoning behind them. "Fascinating," one of the researchers muttered while reviewing my test results. "Complete erosion of conventional moral constraints, but not through psychopathy or antisocial personality development. The inhibitions have simply been replaced by more practical considerations. Survival-focused ethics rather than socially focused ethics. They were studying me like a specimen, documenting the successful transformation of a human being into something more useful for institutional purposes. I had become proof that their methods worked, evidence that any individual could be broken down and reconstructed according to administrative needs if the process was applied with sufficient patience and expertise." The other research subjects were at various stages of the transformation I had completed. Some were recent arrivals who still retained enough of their original personalities to resist the testing protocols. Others were further along the continuum, displaying the kind of mechanical compliance that indicated successful institutional adaptation. A few had progressed beyond even my level of modification, becoming essentially biological machines that responded to stimuli without any trace of independent thought or feeling. Dr. Helena Cross, the lead researcher for my case, explained the purpose of their work during one of our regular interview sessions. She was a thin woman with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense focus that suggested a personal investment in her research that went beyond professional obligation. "The traditional model of incarceration assumes that punishment and deprivation will motivate behavioral change," she said, reviewing notes from my latest round of testing. "But punishment is inefficient, requiring constant monitoring and enforcement. What we're developing here is a more elegant solution. Subjects who internalize institutional goals so completely that external control becomes unnecessary." She was describing the creation of perfect prisoners, individuals who had been psychologically modified to serve institutional purposes without requiring surveillance or coercion. The research conducted here would be applied to correctional facilities throughout the Imperium, creating a generation of inmates who police themselves and each other according to administrative preferences. "You represent our most successful case study," she continued. 10 years of systematic conditioning have produced an individual who functions optimally within institutional parameters while retaining enough cognitive capacity to perform complex tasks. You're a template for the future of Imperial justice." I asked her what would happen when the research was completed and my usefulness as a test subject expired. "That depends on the results of our final evaluations," she said. "Subjects who demonstrate stable adaptation may be transferred to work programs where their skills can be utilized productively. Others may be selected for advanced modification procedures that will enhance their institutional value." Advanced modification meant servitor conversion, the surgical removal of personality and independence in favor of mechanical obedience. I was being offered a choice between slavery and lobotomization, though both options represented forms of death that differed only in their efficiency and finality. The research continued for months, each day bringing new tests and evaluations designed to probe the depths of my transformation. They measured my responses to moral dilemmas, social situations, and stress scenarios with the thoroughness of cartographers mapping unexplored territory. Every aspect of my psychology was documented, categorized, and analyzed for insights that could be applied to future subjects. The final phase of testing involved exposure to experimental conditioning techniques designed to enhance the modifications already achieved through conventional imprisonment. Chemical treatments that altered neurotransmitter function, surgical procedures that damaged specific brain regions, and behavioral therapies that reinforced institutional loyalty through reward and punishment systems more sophisticated than anything used in general population. I submitted to these procedures without resistance because resistance would have been both futile and counterproductive. The researchers noted my compliance in their reports, describing it as evidence of successful adaptation rather than simple resignation. They could not conceive of a form of surrender so complete that it appeared indistinguishable from cooperation. The treatments produced measurable changes in my brain chemistry and cognitive function, fine-tuning the transformation that had been occurring gradually over the previous decade. My capacity for independent thought became more limited, my emotional responses more predictable, my behavioral patterns more consistent with institutional expectations. I was becoming a more perfect version of what the prison system had been trying to create from the beginning. Dr. Cross seemed pleased with the results, though she maintained the professional detachment appropriate for someone studying laboratory animals rather than human beings. During our final interview, she expressed satisfaction with the research outcomes and optimism about the broader applications of their work. The techniques we've developed here will revolutionize correctional practice throughout the Imperium, she said, reviewing the comprehensive documentation of my case. Instead of warehousing criminals until they die or become too expensive to maintain, we'll be producing loyal servants who can contribute productively to Imperial society. She asked if I had any questions about the research or my role in it, as if my curiosity about my own destruction were a relevant consideration in her calculations. I asked her whether she thought the person who had entered Penitentia Maxima 10 years ago would recognize the thing I had become. Probably not, she said after considering the question. But that person was a criminal who threatened Imperial stability through seditious behavior. The individual sitting in front of me now is a loyal subject who understands his proper role in the social order. The transformation represents an improvement by any reasonable standard. She was right. From her perspective, the man who had been arrested for speaking against corruption had been replaced by something more useful and less troublesome. The process had been efficient, thorough, and completely successful in achieving its intended goals. I was a testament to the effectiveness of Imperial justice, proof that rehabilitation was possible if one defined rehabilitation as the complete erasure of undesirable characteristics. The notification of my transfer came 3 days later, delivered by guards who treated me with the mechanical courtesy reserved for valuable equipment being moved between departments. I was being reassigned to a work program on an agri-world where my skills and conditioning would be utilized for food production activities essential to Imperial supply chains. The transport ship was filled with other graduates of various correctional research programs, individuals who had been modified in different ways but shared the common characteristic of complete institutional compliance. We sat in silence during the journey, each of us lost in whatever remained of our individual consciousness, no longer capable of the kind of communication that might have provided comfort or companionship. The agri-world was called Demeter's Garden, a name that suggested abundance and natural beauty, but described a landscape that had been stripped of everything except its capacity to produce food for distant populations. The soil was exhausted from generations of intensive farming, the water was contaminated with agricultural chemicals, and the air carried the dusty smell of a world that had forgotten how to sustain life without constant artificial intervention. The work camps were scattered across the planetary surface, each one focused on a different aspect of food production: grain cultivation, protein synthesis, nutrient extraction from organic waste. The workers were a mixture of indentured servants, penal colonists, and research subjects like myself. All of them modified in various ways to maximize their productivity and minimize their maintenance requirements. I was assigned to Camp 17, a facility that specialized in the cultivation of protein-rich algae and vast artificial lakes that stretched beyond the horizon. The work was repetitive and exhausting, involving the maintenance of complex filtration systems that kept the algae populations healthy while extracting the nutrients that would eventually become processed food for Imperial citizens on more fortunate worlds. The other workers were mostly silent, their personalities erased or suppressed to the point where conversation was neither possible nor necessary. We worked according to schedules programmed into implants that regulated our sleep cycles, nutrition intake, and labor output with mechanical precision. The camp administrators were few in number because extensive supervision was unnecessary when the workers had been conditioned to police themselves. Days blurred into months, months into years, as we performed our assigned functions with the reliability of biological machinery. I maintained the filtration systems, harvested the algae, and processed the nutrients according to protocols that had been burned into my memory through repetition and reinforcement. The work was my existence, and existence was the work, a perfect closed loop that required no external motivation or reward. Sometimes, in the brief moments between sleep and waking, I would remember fragments of dreams that seemed to come from someone else's life. Images of sunlight falling through windows onto wooden floors, the sound of children laughing, the taste of food that had been prepared with care rather than engineered for efficiency. These memories felt like messages from a ghost, communications from someone who had died so long ago that even his name had been forgotten. But the dreams always faded, dissolved by the harsh light of morning and the immediate requirements of another day's labor. The person who had experienced those moments of joy and connection was as distant from my current reality as the Emperor himself, a figure from history whose existence could be acknowledged but not meaningfully comprehended. The years passed, marked only by the subtle changes in my aging body and the gradual deterioration of the equipment I maintained. My hair became completely white. My hands developed the tremor that came from decades of exposure to industrial chemicals, and my vision began to fail in ways that made detailed work increasingly difficult. I was becoming obsolete, a piece of biological machinery that was wearing out and would eventually need to be replaced. The end came not dramatically but with bureaucratic efficiency. A medical evaluation determined that my productivity had declined below acceptable thresholds, and the cost of maintaining me in working condition exceeded the value of my continued labor. I was scheduled for termination, a process that would be quick, painless, and economically optimal for the facility's operational requirements. They gave me 3 days to complete my final work assignments, ensuring that the transition to my replacement would be smooth and that no productivity would be lost during the changeover. I spent those days performing the same tasks I had performed for years, maintaining the same equipment, following the same protocols, as if nothing had changed except the arbitrary deadline that now defined the limits of my existence. On the final day, I was escorted to a processing facility where other obsolete workers waited for their turn at termination. We sat in rows like products on a conveyor belt, each of us tagged with identification numbers and processing codes that would ensure accurate record-keeping during our disposal. The room was quiet except for the soft humming of machinery and the occasional shuffle of feet as someone was called forward for processing. When my number was announced, I stood and walked to the designated station without hesitation or fear. The technician who would perform the procedure was efficient and professional, checking my identification tags and verifying the termination authorization before preparing the injection that would stop my heart. She worked with the casual competence of someone who had performed this task hundreds of times before. "Any final statements for the record?" she asked, more from habit than genuine interest in my response. I told her that I had been dead for 11 years, 7 months, and 22 days, and that I was grateful they were finally allowing my body to catch up with the rest of me. She noted my response in her logbook and administered the injection. The chemical cocktail entered my bloodstream and began shutting down my vital systems with the same efficiency that had characterized every other aspect of my time in Imperial custody. My vision dimmed, my breathing became shallow, and my consciousness began to fade like a light being slowly extinguished. In those final moments, as my brain ceased its futile attempts to process sensory information, I experienced something that might have been peace. The constant vigilance that had defined my existence for over a decade finally relaxed. The endless calculation of survival strategies became irrelevant, and the crushing weight of institutional compliance lifted from shoulders that would soon be still forever. The last thought that crossed my dying mind was not regret or anger or fear, but a simple observation that the Imperium had achieved its goal with perfect efficiency. The man who had once believed in justice and spoken against corruption was completely gone, replaced by something that had served imperial interests faithfully until its usefulness expired. The system had worked exactly as designed, transforming a problem into a resource and then disposing of that resource when it was no longer needed. My death was recorded in the facility's operational logs as routine maintenance, no more significant than the replacement of a worn-out filter or the disposal of contaminated waste. The body that had housed 11 years of suffering was processed through the facility's organic recycling systems, its constituent nutrients eventually becoming fertilizer for the algae farms, where other modified workers would continue the endless cycle of production and consumption. Prison in the 41st millennium is not punishment but transformation, not correction but consumption. It takes human beings and converts them into something more useful and less troublesome, grinding away everything that makes life meaningful until only function remains. The process is efficient, cost-effective, and completely successful in achieving its intended goals. There is no redemption in this system because redemption implies the possibility of return to a previous state, and the modifications inflicted upon prisoners are irreversible by design. There is no justice because justice requires the consideration of right and wrong, and institutional efficiency recognizes no moral categories beyond productive and counterproductive. There is no hope because hope depends on the belief that conditions might improve, and the only change prisoners can expect is the gradual decay that leads from slavery to death. The guards, the administrators, the researchers who operate these facilities are not monsters, though they perform monstrous tasks. They are servants of a system that has calculated the most efficient methods for converting human problems into human resources, and they execute their duties with the same professional competence that characterizes all imperial bureaucracy. Evil, in this context, is not a matter of individual malice but institutional logic carried to its inevitable conclusion. Those who enter imperial prisons leave behind everything that made them human except the basic biological functions that can be harnessed for productive labor. Their minds are stripped of independence, their bodies modified for optimal performance, and their spirits crushed so completely that the concept of resistance becomes literally unthinkable. They become perfect prisoners, completely compliant, totally predictable, and utterly disposable. This is the reality of justice in the Imperium of Man, a system that has abandoned the pretense of rehabilitation in favor of simple resource extraction. Prisoners are raw material to be processed, not citizens to be corrected, and their fate is determined not by the nature of their crimes, but by the efficiency requirements of institutional operation. The man I had been before my arrest would not recognize the thing I became, and perhaps that represents a form of mercy. The complete erasure of identity eliminates the suffering that would come from remembering what was lost. The perfect prisoner feels no grief for his destroyed humanity because he has forgotten that humanity ever existed. In the end, imperial justice achieves its goals with absolute efficiency, the elimination of threats to social stability through the complete transformation of threatening individuals into useful resources. The process is brutal but thorough, cost-effective but comprehensive, and it serves the Imperium's needs perfectly while destroying everything that might have made those needs questionable. This is what prison means in the 41st millennium, not a place of punishment or rehabilitation, but a factory that takes broken people and breaks them more thoroughly until they become exactly what the system needs them to be. And when they are no longer useful even in their broken state, they are discarded with the same efficiency that characterized their transformation. There is no escape from this system because it does not simply confine the body but reconstructs the mind. There is no resistance because resistance requires a sense of self that the process systematically destroys. There is no hope because hope depends on possibilities that the system is designed to eliminate. The only truth left at the end is the truth I discovered in my final moments, that death, when it finally comes, represents not defeat but completion. The system achieves its perfect victory not when prisoners are killed, but when they become so thoroughly modified that killing them is unnecessary. My death was simply the final step in a process that had been completed years earlier, the disposal of waste that had served its purpose.